So in the Old Testament, the Father is not the Son of the New Testament, but in the New Testament, the Son is the Father. In the Old Testament, the Father is not the Son of the New Testament, but in the New Testament, the Son is the Father. Shalom Misyalak, and this is March 22nd, 2017, and this is another lesson in the New Testament is Fake series. This is lesson number 48, and this lesson is entitled Number 1. We've been taught for a long time that the Son of God in the New Testament, identified in chapters such as John chapter 1, which I'm going to read from in a moment, is the Son of God. I teach that he is not the Son of God, has nothing to do with him, except that he is linked to him by deception. And I'm going to show here that the Creator is the one who did creation, because we are taught that the Creator made this Son, Jesus, as the first spirit in creation. He's the first being to be made, which then means he was made before man, he was made before Adam, and he was made before all the creatures of the earth, and made before everything else that we see in the creation story, such as the trees, the sun, the moon, the animals, everything. So he made this being who we now know is supposedly the Son of God, and he is known as Jesus in the New Testament, or Yahushua, Yeshua, Joshua, etc., or the Messiah. It says here from John chapter 1, I'll read from verse 1 to 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we were taught, and I was certainly taught from I was a child and in Bible college as well when I was in the Christian religion, that this Word was actually Jesus. I used to read it like this a lot, and many other preachers and other Sunday school teachers and ministers and just lay people in the church would read it like this on their own, or when teaching, or when witnessing outside, or just in general just reading it, would read it like this, and it would be correct for all of us, from pastors and bishops all the way down to the person that just joined the church. It would read like this in our own words. In the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. People still teach this today. It goes on, the same was in the beginning with God. So they're saying that this Jesus or the Messiah was there in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So they're saying Jesus was made first before everyone and everything else, and then he was given the task to make everything for the Father. But he's not his Father, because this whole thing isn't real. Like I said, it's just deception. And without him, Jesus, nothing was made. That's what it's saying. Just for the purpose of this lesson, I will rename, allow me please to use the word parties here. I will rename both parties, number 1 and number 2, meaning the Father and the so-called Son Jesus, or meaning God and the created Spirit Jesus, who is known as the Messiah. So number 1 would be God, who pretty much all of us understand that when the first verse in Genesis says in the beginning God, it is speaking of the one who we usually call the Father, and he is not Jesus. He is not his Son. So I'm not sure why they make the Son to be the Father if the Father is not the Son. Just as if you are a father, you are not your actual son, but you may have a son. So you cannot be your own son, but somehow your son is you. It just doesn't make sense. So in the Old Testament, the Father is not the Son of the New Testament, but in the New Testament, the Son is the Father. Confusion. But the same New Testament says God is not the author of confusion. So we'll rename the Genesis 1 verse 1 God or Spirit number 1, and Jesus from the New Testament or the Messiah number 2. So then verse 3 would read something like this. All things were made by number 2, the Messiah, and without him was not anything that was made. So basically then they're saying number 2 did everything. That's going to be a problem here, because look at, and then if you consider the whole book of the Old Testament being number 1 kind of book and the New Testament being number 2 book, since it came after, just to play with the number 1 and number 2 and stretch it a little further, then let's go to book number 1, the Old Testament, and see what book 1 says before book 2 came along to say something else. Listen to what book 1 says about number 1, which is the Creator. Psalm 33 verse 6 to 9. This here is going to show that it's speaking about number 1 and not number 2, the Messiah. Psalm 33 verse 6, by the word of number 1, or by the word of the Most High, were the heavens made. So like when you read a creation story in Genesis chapter 1, that's talking about number 1, the Creator, or who we would call the Father. No one reads that, especially in the church I grew up and in the whole organization and in all the other organizations that I became a part of in my entire Christian life. The organizations that I became a part of or associated myself with, visited and was around them for a time, and I was around quite a bit. I was in Bible college. I learned a lot of actually Pentecostal history there, plus did my own studies in Pentecostal history. And if you look back through my channel, you will find actually in the same New Testament is Fake series, you'll find a video that I did. I can't remember the name of it. It's probably called Azusa Street Revival. And I give some history there because, I mean, I knew the Pentecostal history well enough. Just actually maybe about 3 years ago, I actually refreshed my mind with a lot of the Pentecostal history from the United States and from Canada, although I did a little bit more of the history worldwide, but it more focused on the United States and in Canada, tracing the history of the Pentecostals. Having heard me say that I have very good knowledge of the history of Pentecostal type churches, not just one organization, but different organizations coming from way back, and I can tell you how some of these organizations actually began, you know, like the UPC, UPCI, and a lot of others, even some of the states of PAW and so on. I got history of those stuff, like, you know, I went through that. So knowing that I have given that kind of information here, at least to say that I know about that information well enough, you can understand that it is not a stretch for me to say that over the years from I was a small child growing up, I was well aware that the Pentecostal churches do, and the Christian churches in general, because I was, you know, around other churches that were not Pentecostal, they absolutely say and teach that Jesus is God. And they absolutely teach that the Genesis 1 verse 1 God or Spirit that dealt with the chaos mentioned in Genesis 1 verse 2 as well, and that created the heaven and the earth and so on, that God is the Father, or is number 1, as I am calling him here for illustrations in this lesson to come across to us more clearly. They teach that, they believe that. They believe that Spirit mentioned, or that God, that Elohim, is number 1, not number 2. So it is a problem for me to figure out why in the number 2 book in the New Testament, why John chapter 1 is claiming that the number 2 God, which is the Messiah or the Son, why they're claiming that he is the one who did the number 1 kind of stuff from Genesis chapter 1. Because Genesis chapter 1 does not allow for any interpretation of the actions of number 1 to be attributed to number 2. It does not mention anything about number 2 anywhere in the creation story. Only when you read the pages of the New Testament, the book number 2, do you then go back in your mind and insert a pin here and there to fill in some supposed missing in book number 1, which is the Old Testament. But someone has squeezed like a wedge, squeezing and hammering that wedge in to say, make it fit right here, make this understanding fit right there. So now, Psalm 33 verse 6 again now, it says, by the word of number 1 were the Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his number 1's mouth. That then means that this number 1 book, the Old Testament, is telling you that not some or none of the host of them were made by number 1, but that all of them were made by number 2, like the New Testament is telling you. Book number 1, the Old Testament, is actually saying to you that number 1 made the heavens and made all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. All of them. If you've got 5 books on the table and you're going to put them in your bag to leave with them, and you ask somebody to put them all in the bag, 5 books, you don't expect them to put 3 of them in because you said all. So nothing is left out. Nothing will be left on the table. So when this says number 1 made all the host of them, that means he leaves nothing. The testimony in the Old Testament leaves nothing. The writer here in the Old Testament leaves nothing. King David, this is his psalm or his prayer, a man after the Most High's own heart, leaves nothing for a number 2 God to claim. So he made all of them by the breath of his mouth. And we know that it does speak of the breath in Genesis chapter 1. It does, doesn't it? Of course it does. It's telling you how number 1 did it. And I'm not trying to be, disrespectful to how the scriptures speak of it in any way. I just have to use this term number 1 and number 2 because I'm trying to reason. Because maybe somehow if you see it in some kind of way of reason, because see, sometimes we just stick so much with just the words on the paper, on the page of the Bible, that it tends to make us stay locked into religious thoughts so much that some of us, but not all, some of us cannot figure out what it is saying because the religiosity of the words on the paper does not allow us to break from the religious thinking that is actually what keeps us trapped or locked in to the deception. So you got to find ways to reason it out. Choose some other words that don't seem so religious sometimes so that you can see that your mind can actually work outside of the confines of religious teaching that has been given to you. Now, after you go through that thought, if you don't find that it helps or helps enough, and you're going to return to whatever, that's up to you. All I know is I can show you right here, and there it is very clear. If you put a name number 1 to the God of the Old Testament and a name number 2 to the one in the New Testament, you can clearly see how logically it makes sense as it goes. Now, verse 7, he gathereth, meaning the number 1 God gathereth the waters of the sea together as an heap. Number 1 layeth up the depth in storehouses. And see, when it says like he gathers up the waters of the sea, look at like in Genesis chapter 1. And number 1 made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So that's an example there of him gathering the water together as a heap, right? He's putting them in one place. He's separating stuff. And it might also come to your mind the crossing of the Red Sea and so on. But it goes on in verse 8. Let all the earth fear the number 1 power. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him, or in awe of number 1. Why? Because the number 1 power, or the creator / the father, is the one who did all of these things. So he is the one who gets the awe. Nothing about number 2. Verse 9, for he spake and it was done. In other words, number one spake and it was done. Yet John chapter 1 is telling you that all things were made by number two, and without number two nothing was made. But this here is saying, for number one spake and it was done. Number one commanded and it stood fast. I mean, what else do we need? You can say some of these things to people so clearly, and they very well see it. They very well know. But people find it so difficult to break away from Jesus that they will sacrifice truth and bring it to death in their minds in order to cleave unto the deception. But in closing, I just want to mention, it's not that they're trying so hard to cleave to the deception. The deception is cleaving to them and won't let them go. And because they refuse to accept truth when it comes, they cannot be free of it. They cannot release the grasp that it has on them. It locks them, it grabs them, it grips them, and they can't break the hold that it has on them. Because the hold is only going to be broken when you accept the truth. People will hear something that makes scriptural truth, you find the verses, and it even makes common sense. And they will spend a whole other year trying to find a way in the scripture to take it down. When it's very clear, simple logic, number one, number two, there's a difference there. Number one has all the accolades, has all the praise, has all the awe for doing all these things in creation. And a number two God comes in a number two book that was made by the Romans, as a lot of people have pointed out, and all of a sudden we find that number two did it. Now, if all things were made by number two, why is it that number one was spoken of in the Old Testament as the one who did it, and even did things by the breath of his mouth, when we very well know that the breath that caused life and caused things to be, and the mouth that spake in Genesis chapter 1 was by number